I had a chance to live in Southeast Asia for 3 years, working in areas where the tsunami had wiped out literally hundreds of thousands of people in one real moment. One quick story that was interesting, I was helping these folks rebuild their homes. We had local, essentially subcontractors working with us, building these homes. So an older lady comes down the street, shuffling her feet and says, "Hey, my doorknob's not working right. This paint's not looking good." And in the moment, I laughed at myself. Now again, these were, victims of a horrible tsunami. And so they obviously needed a lot of help. But this was a person with no money. And it had just been a couple years before I'd been working with luxury clients on a similar thing. This lady had a punch list. And from that moment, I was like, okay, we're going to take these guys that are subcontractors. At the end of the build, we're going to hand the keys over. We're going to go through the punch list. We're going to sign off on it. And from there, I never had any other people come back and say we had issues. So I realized in that moment, whether it's first world or we kind of think of developing country or third world, these are clients in a way. So we kind of have to learn that.
Welcome to the Builder Straight Talk podcast with your host, Michael Creasa. Get the unfiltered truth from the trenches of construction, real estate, and funding. This episode is made possible by our parent company, Sound Capital. Funding built for builders.
Well, hey there, friend. Michael Creasa here, host of Builder Straight Talk, and welcome to this week's episode. I had privilege, and I mean that word in all sincerity, the privilege of sitting down with a gentleman by the name of Gabe Chatham. And he is a third generational builder. And the story was fascinating, right to the very roots of where it began on a pig farm. That's where his grandfather started the first build after he came back from the war, to where Gabe and his brothers are today. As I said, third generation builders. And we touched on so much like faith, legacy, religion, and it's a wonderful conversation. But some of the stuff that we talked about that really molded Gabe on his journey, back in 2004, when the tsunamis hit in Asia, he was actually there. He went with a group of people, I think from his church, to help rebuild homes and to help families, people that he's never met. And the impression that they made on him actually helped forge the man he is today. Some of the other things that we talked about, which were really, really fascinating, is what it really means to carry the responsibility of being a third generation builder. How builders can protect their reputation when their family name is literally on every neighborhood sign they put up. The lessons Gabe learned rebuilding homes in '04 in Southeast Asia, and why builders must stay disciplined during the inevitable cycles and the housing market, and so much more. And speaking of so much more, by the way, I need your help here. We don't run any ads on our episodes. It is all about content and things that we can glean from our guest at the time that hopefully you can apply into your business. So what I'm asking you to do with a simple click of your mouse, subscribe, like, and share. I'm going to repeat that. Subscribe, like, and share, because that will help take our little puppet show, get it into the algorithms so more builders like you can learn from what we're doing here at Builder Straight Talk. So once again, subscribe, like, and share. Now, without further ado, let's jump into this conversation with Gabe. I know you're going to enjoy it. Well, hey there, Gabe. Thanks for being on today's show. I'm really excited about where this is going to take us. You've got such a diverse background, and being a third generation builder means that you've got a lot of wisdom to share. So without further ado, let me just say welcome to the call, and thanks for taking time out today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate the invitation.
So third generation home builder, was the die already cast that when you were born, you're going into construction and that's all there is to it?
I'm the oldest of three boys. So Gabe, obviously myself, and then Miles and Lance, and the three of us, work today in our family business. And so we were all around it growing up. I can remember, after church on Sundays, Dad would say, "Hey, let's run by, this neighborhood and check on it, or let's go check on this house." And all of us are like, "No, Dad, we want to get home and play, or, go see our friends." So we were around it, got to see a lot of the neighborhoods that were in our area that they were working on. So I don't know that for any of us, this was an absolute, we want to be in it. But over time, I think we saw the value of the industry, how it employed so many folks, and how, really you're able to be a blessing to your community if you're really doing, home building and development correctly.
Now, it was your grandfather that started this way back. And correct me if I'm wrong here. So he fights in World War II, comes back, starts up his own building company. My parents went through the war as well. So my parents came from Ukraine in 52 to Canada. And my dad never really talked about the war. And what I found was the people that talked the most were the ones, how do I say this, Blake, were the ones that experienced the less. if you will, or the least. The ones that said very little were the ones that had the deepest scars. So, were there any stories that your grandfather shared that sort of inspired you to do maybe, philosophically or morally? Did he influence the way you're building and running your company today?
Oftentimes we would ask, my grandfather, Howard Chatham was his name, stories about the war. And I think in his mind, he was in the here and now. And so he'd be happy to answer questions or share some stories. He fought in London. And so they were primarily on the logistics side, which was, I think, a good role, from what I understand, in terms of not having to be necessarily front line. So a lot of it was logistics, making sure supplies got where they needed to go. But he would talk about being in London and the city was being bombed and how they had to, take cover and obviously feared for their lives at time. But, for him, he grew up on a little, series of farms in what we now know as North Fulton and a couple surrounding counties. So, I mean, he literally came off the farm and went to, fight for his country. So for him, it was always important, obviously, to love and serve our country. And so again, he was always open to a conversation. We'd have to pull stories out of him. But, for him, it was never trying to live in the past. He really was here and now. What can we do? How are we, doing a great job for our families and our community and our businesses and our churches? So that was kind of his focus. But no, we're always honored, that he fought and served. And, in fact, in my house, after he passed, we had a flag that was flown over the U.S. Capitol that was brought. And, I hope my brothers don't hear it, but I've got it in my house, prominently displayed. And that's like we got a lot of cool things in the house, but that's number one for me. And I get to tell my kids about it. So it's kind of a neat conversation piece and, certainly honored that my granddad fought for our country.
That's very nice. Before we continue here, let's kind of set the pin here in terms of like who you are. So tell us a little bit about the company, where you guys are building, primarily the price point, and how many homes on average do you do per year?
So we're Chathambilt Homes, and, we can talk about the backstory, but it started in 1948 by my grandfather. So third generation now. And so our office is in Alpharetta, Georgia, which is obviously, Atlanta being the capital. That's also in Fulton County. So we're in the northern part of Fulton County. So much of our work currently is in, North Fulton. It's in some surrounding counties, Forsyth, Gwinnett, Cherokee. We've got some deals in some other locations as well. But, for us on the build side, high-end custom is where we focus. We're on the Southern Living Custom Builder Board. We were Custom Builder of the Year for Southern Living in 2021. And so that's kind of the space we play in. So we're probably, 10 to 12 homes a year on the build, occasionally a little bit of remodeling, but that's kind of our focus. Now, on the development side, we develop for ourselves, for national builders, and just kind of opportunistic. We love doing builder programs, which would include ourselves as Chathambilt, as well as some other, high-end custom builders that we invite in. So, the big third lane that we run in is the real estate brokerage side, which is a big part of what we do. So, for us, we love building houses, but sometimes it makes a lot more sense to sell lots and help market those homes once they're done.
Unpack that middle ground for me. So I get custom, I get the real estate side in the middle. So is that spec building you're doing, production building?
So most of what we do, for we're building, most of the times it's spec, but, oftentimes we're building on people's property, or maybe we have a lot or piece of property that somebody wants us to build their dream home on. So we'll do that, work through that process with, trusted architect partners to get the design and then work through building that home. We love doing the spec construction. And sometimes it just depends on the market. Maybe there's more opportunity on the spec side, more opportunity potentially on the, we kind of think of it as pre-sale side. And then just because it's such a challenge to develop lots, in the current environment, oftentimes we'll partner with, other high-end custom builders that we have a great relationship with that we know can play well in the sandbox together in a neighborhood. So sometimes we'll have multiple, high-end custom builders and what we kind of call a builder program type development model.
So I get the custom side. A customer will approach you. They'll say, hey, Gabe, here's what we want to build. They'll go through various floor plans that you have, or maybe they have their own dream. I get that part. When you're working with another builder, how do you decide on what a project, let me rephrase that, what a viable project will be that gets you excited about wanting to build with that partner and actually take the risk on, either you're putting your own money in or bank's money, but that's a huge commitment that there's actually that big element of trust with the person that you're partnering with. So let's talk a little bit about the trust aspect. But again, what is it that fires you up that says, yeah, this is a go versus a no-go?
So we love, building, developing in communities that are somewhat close to us because in a perfect world, we love to drive every project every day, walk every house every day, checking on everything that we do. And so for us having other high-end custom builder partners, we're selling lots to those other builders, and then we'll help on, manage on the design review process. And then in the end, we're sometimes, if you've got a couple different builders on adjacent lots, hey, the brick mason may have borrowed your water, so we need to, work that out, or maybe somebody threw some lumber on your side of the line. It shouldn't have happened. So, who can play well in the sandbox together is kind of a crucial concept we come back to. So, but these are, builders that we have had good experience with. So much of our relational equity is built through our local home builders association, our state HBA. And so for us, that's where we really find great partners if we didn't know them already. And so those builders love the opportunity because it's so difficult to develop lots. So they want a place to go. So they're happy to have an opportunity to buy lots. And so, from there, helping cast the vision, what type of theme are we going with in this community? What are the covenants in terms of, size, square footage, finish level? And so we're meeting, again, they're independently running their own business, but obviously we're participating with them from the standpoint that we want to make sure that they're building a terrific house that in a neighborhood that's going to bear our name that we're proud of. And then also, if we're going to, sell those homes, we want to make sure our builder friends are informed of where the market is. What are the hot button issues people are really looking for, the big ticket items that are worth, spending money on, or maybe where, maybe there's some places to save. But just because we're also on the front line in terms of selling homes, we kind of understand where the market's at. So it's really a win-win. And so many of these builders, they're calling us, hey, where are we going next? Or where's the next opportunity? Or, hey, I saw your sign up over there. Can I get in on that deal? So, and again, that's all to dad and granddad's credit, but we're thankful we have good rapport and a little bit of a following, with a lot of the good builders in our community.
Yeah, interesting. You say it's to their credit, but you're keeping that account up to date because they're calling you. So kudos to you, Gabe, for that one.
Thank you.
There's a word that you said that homes that you can be proud of. Is there any particular home that you built that you look back on now and you say, that it inspires you every time you drive by?
It's interesting. I was just had lunch with a friend, and he was telling me he's in a church small group, and he was meeting at somebody's house, and he was sitting around the house talking to the guy about the house, and he said, yeah, we're really proud of this house. This is a Chathambilt home from the 60s, and obviously I wasn't exactly around in those days, but there's some of these neighborhoods we drive by, we hear the stories, because we're in the real estate agency side, we see, when new listings pop up, and sometimes it's a house that from, decades ago, but it'll list it. We don't know the agent, we don't know the homeowner, but it'll list it as a Chathambilt home. And so we know there's some value there. I think one of the particular places that we have a lot of appreciation for the home that we grew up on, my brothers and I, in Roswell, we later developed into a neighborhood called, and it's the only one we've ever used our name on, but called Chatham Park in Roswell. And it's a spectacular neighborhood. And we're working on, there's one lot left in that neighborhood. So we're working on an opportunity to build and kind of complete that community. So that one's certainly special. But, as Dad often shares with, he when we're developing now, he wants to make sure we're proud of these things decades down the road. And so it is fun to drive through, these old neighborhoods and see how well they've held up and how well people have cared for their homes and just see the values continue to grow. Obviously, North Atlanta is a great market, but just to see these folks and how much appreciation they've gained in their homes, is really part of that enjoyment, because we know typically this is somebody's biggest investment. So we want to make sure that we're creating a great value and marketing in such a way that they recognize that value.
You're familiar with the term that, pride of ownership, but for you, it must be the pride that you put in to build that home. I find that there's a friend that I had, he was a painter. He's a motivational speaker now, but growing up, he worked with his dad, who was a professional painter. And so that's what he would do for summers, part-time job sort of thing. And when he'd be finished, he's climbing down the ladder, putting stuff away, and his dad would look at him and say, son, would you write your name to that? And if he couldn't say, yes, Dad, I can write my name to that, it was back up on the ladder and finish it the way it should be done. Because everything that you do is an extension of our family name. Don't ever forget that. I suspect that you treat that the same way, that whenever you're doing a home, in essence, you're writing a blank check. Is that fair to say?
It's a terrific analogy. And, now granted, in the early days, in the late 40s, early 50s, monuments weren't necessarily typical, but, probably from the late 50s on, these neighborhood monuments have our name, etched in the stone of the monument. So for us, yes, it's a big deal, to drive past it. And, even riding around with my kids, obviously they're younger, having a chance to say, hey, look, that's one of our neighborhoods. That's got your name on it. Trying to help instill for, my brothers and I, for all of our kids to say, hey, there's a sense of pride here. And a lot of people do a lot of phenomenal work in all these communities we're in, but there's just something a little bit unique to creating homes, creating value. Oftentimes these are great school districts and people want to be in these areas. So to think that, there's existing housing stock that we've created or some new homes that hopefully we can create, for folks is really special. And to bump into people who live in one of our homes or hear stories from people who either lived in our homes or maybe sold real estate with my dad or granddad, or, builders that we meet through the Home Builders Association. It's just neat because we get to hear a lot of those stories and people say, oh, I don't want to bother you with an old story. I'm like, no, please tell me, because you're going to capture something my dad or granddad would have never shared, or maybe they've got so many stories they forgot that one. So please, we want to hear all those stories.
When you're driving around with your kids now, when I think back to what you just said about the house that you grew up in, it was built in the 50s and you weren't born yet. So you were still in the planning phase. The diagrams were drawn, but the house, you weren't constructed yet. Is there an aspiration in you that you hope to see that your kids are going to follow in your footsteps so it becomes a fourth generation company?
I think so. There's, amongst my brothers and I, there's 12 grandkids, 4, 4, and 4. So we got the 12 tribes of Israel covered. I don't know if there's enough places for 12 kids to work, but there's certainly in our industry collectively, there's so many opportunities. And, even on the trade side, which dad and granddad had a little bit more to do with, decades ago, but there's so many opportunities there. We don't see enough new trades coming in to replace a lot of the great trades that we're losing, aging out or, retirement, different things. So we certainly would love that. And even my middle brother, Miles, his children are older than mine. And, his older children have helped us with whether it's real estate events or some marketing or some planning or programming. And so we're seeing them get to dip their toe in the water, and, they're all fantastic kids. So we'd love to see them, find a place in our collective businesses. But we certainly would love have something for them to get to hand off when the day comes. So yeah, we're certainly encouraged by, the next generation coming behind us. And I think they have appreciation for, again, I point back to dad and granddad, literally and figuratively the foundation that we stand on. And so I think hopefully we can, continue to be good stewards of that.
That's great. I realize that faith is a big part of who you are and what you do. And oddly enough, you've got a master's in divinity. Tell me about that. How did that come to be?
My grandfather, he began building, again, it was kind of a accidental scenario, like a lot of great stories start, just building a house for him and my grandmother. And somebody came along and wanted to buy it. And this was an old pig farm in what was a very rural community called Buckhead, just north of Atlanta, which those, folks that know the area would laugh that was ever the case. But you realized, hey, I've got a chance to make a run at this. But during that process, he always had a heart for planting churches. And so he would tell the story often about the very first church that he planted. He'd hired the pastor, obviously collectively, but he was kind of leading the point. And this pastor was stepping on a faith. He didn't have anything. So granddad said, well, I'll give you a house to live in, and I'll buy you groceries every week until we can, get enough folks here to start paying your salary. And that was really his heartbeat. So he planted 2 churches, including a church that I grew up in, and also built a home through our Georgia Baptist Convention for mentally handicapped men, which is still, going great today, and even did some work trying to help international on the church planting side. So I think for my brothers and I, passed down through my parents, faith was a crucial component. And so one of the neat things for me, I really felt through my time in college a call to spend some time overseas doing missions. And so, it was really a great opportunity to study at a seminary to get international church planting experience. So with that, the whole goal was to go overseas. And so I had a chance to live in Southeast Asia for 3 years, working in areas where the tsunami had wiped out literally hundreds of thousands of people in one real moment the day after Christmas in 2004. So strangely, kind of the job description was a little bit vague just because it was such need. But in that process, we began helping people rebuild their homes that had lost everything for the families that were still alive at that moment, and helping them restart their businesses. So this was in a closed area where, there wasn't allowed to be any Christian access, but because we were bringing great value and helping these folks rebuild their homes, there was an opportunity. And so with that, I had a chance to share my faith in a closed environment, which, was very fruitful. I'm thankful for the teammates I served with. But, one quick story that was interesting, I was helping, these folks rebuild their homes. We had local, essentially subcontractors working with us, building these homes. And so I was down the street, and again, these are literal dirt roads. I mean, we're building with primitive tools in some cases, but again, these people have a house they didn't have before that was wiped out before. So an older lady comes down the street, shuffling her feet, and says, "Hey, it's all in the local language." She said, "My doorknob's not working right. This paint's not looking good." And in the moment, I laughed at myself. Now again, these were victims of a horrible tsunami, and so they obviously needed a lot of help. But this was a person with no money, and it had just been a couple years before I'd been working with luxury clients on a similar thing. This lady had a punch list. And so, from that moment, I was like, okay, we're going to take these guys that are subcontractors at the end of the build. We're going to hand the keys over. We're going to go through the punch list. We're going to sign off on it. And from there, I never had any other people come back and say we had issues. So I realized in that moment, whether it's first world or we kind of think of developing country or third world, these are clients in a way, so we kind of have to learn that. But again, really the platform was a great opportunity to be able to point people to Jesus, which for me was incredibly rewarding.
Let's expand on that a bit further. So through that experience, was there a lesson that you learned, or did it change the meaning of what you had for shelter and community?
I think you realize just how common the needs are, no matter, I certainly grew up in an affluent community, and my parents were incredibly gracious, grandparents as well, making sure all of our needs and then some were met. So we never had any issues there. But I think, for one, you certainly have a different level of appreciation. But bigger than that, from a faith standpoint, you realize these needs are very common. I mean, folks, there's a spiritual need. And so no matter what the context is, no matter what the language is, no matter what, the unique way of maybe sharing your faith is, that's a consistent thing across anyone in the world, whether no matter where they live. So I think for me, it was great. And so even now translating that into, ministry that we still do today, we realize that's the common need. And what I think was especially encouraging to me, and I think this is the heartbeat of everybody in our family, is, this idea of missions or ministry is not vocational. It's not a dedicated time or place. It literally is a lifestyle. And so, while we were building and helping rebuild lives, in the tsunami destroyed area, whether it was their businesses or their homes or helping them with education, we were sharing our faith as we were a part of that community. And it translates exactly to what we do today in our communities, where we live and people we come in contact with, and, encouraging people, praying with people, trying to really help encourage them to recognize what it means to follow Jesus.
I'm really fascinated by this experience that you had while you were there. Was there, we'll call it a road to Damascus moment, that it was a family or a conversation, something that stuck with you that made you now really appreciate your family and shelter?
I saw some people decide to turn from the local faith, which in that particular location was, you could be subject to death. The stakes were high. And so for those folks to say, hey, I'm willing to risk my life to make this decision. I'm willing to take the step of baptism and put myself out there as somebody who identifies with Jesus as opposed to the local faith. That was significant, because we get little, jabs here and there, maybe for our faith occasionally. But when you realize something like that, is really taking that step, it has a greater significance. And what I think was a unique opportunity for me and through this process of building homes, was that you recognize there's a sense of dignity and place that comes from having a home. And that's no different, so that's why I think that gives us a little extra energy when it comes to advocacy for home ownership, or even just having a home, even the rental community, but just having a place and the sense of community and family and having some consistency. Obviously, there's reasons why people, move from time to time, but allowing, especially kids, but families to have a common place to live, be under a roof together. I just think there's a lot of dignity and value that comes from that. And so I think, a lot of that ties back to, I believe ties back to scripture, but in so many ways, yes, I think recognizing the value of building a home, the equity that comes from that, but also a sense of place, sense of community and belonging, I think is crucial.
Do you think when you were being approached, was that because of, there's two facets here. It's one, to walk the walk and talk the talk, so to speak, but you were actually there giving of your time, giving of your talents, building these homes. At the same time, who you are as a person is coming through, and your faith is coming through. Do you think that was the magnet, if you will, that prompted people to approach you and then take that risk to say, I want to find out more about your faith? And I don't want to say, how do I get involved? Because that sounds like a club, but you know where I'm going with this, that they're actually crossing that threshold from what they know, what is comfortable, into this abyss, as you said, that could be life-changing or life-ending.
I think so many of these people, they recognized that obviously I left my home, my what was comfortable to me, living in, call it much more primitive situations, but they recognized somebody came from another country to come spend some time with us, to get to know us. Just learning their language had a ton of value, believe it or not, because so many, especially in that day, a lot of NGO, non-government organizations were coming through trying to provide relief. But, for me and the other folks that I worked with through our organization to be able to say, we're here, we're living down the street from you, we're living in your village area, we're learning your language, we're eating at your table, we're completely engrossed in your community. We're not just kind of driving through, dropping some stuff off for you and taking off to the next town. I think that created a sense of, all right, you're really here for us, you really care for us. And so when I was able to use, whether it was storying or just my own testimony, it resonated differently because these folks realized, you're here, you obviously care enough for us to be here. And obviously that takes time, and you're providing value, not a true handout, but like, hey, let's work together and let's figure out how we can meet your needs, and going through processes that were really beneficial. Again, a lot of it points back to Dignity and giving them a role in that process. But I do think that opened the door to conversations. And even if it was, a little bit sticky from the standpoint of it's not something they were familiar with or currently had a system of belief that this, my messaging fit, because of the investment in them and their community and being there, really that provided an audience that only that time and effort could have created.
I'm going to say back around 2000, I was invited to Ukraine, and I spent 6 months there. And I was with a group, Help Us Help the Children, and we were bringing humanitarian aid to the orphanages. And I had the opportunity of being the western part, the eastern part, western part of Ukraine. So Kiev, Ternopil, Odessa, kind of where my parents hailed from. So that was really neat that I could actually walk the ground where my parents and grandparents came from, through the different orphanages. Some were run brilliantly, and some were, how do I say, something that even Dickens couldn't imagine in his worst novels. And when I got back from this, and I'm trying to recalibrate, if you will, from that experience to coming back to where there's an abundance of everything. And I remember there was this epiphany, if you will, and it was a conversation I overheard. And it was a couple of kids, they were arguing over the iPad. And one of them had the latest, greatest brand new one. And the other kid had one that was a year old. And he was complaining about, oh, my parents won't buy me the new one. And I just wanted to go over there and slap him on the side of the ear, because you have no idea what you have versus to a country or a major part of the world that can only dream of the worst day that you're going to have will be the best day they'll ever have. When you came back onto American soil, was there anything like that? Like, I don't want to say an aha, but let's call it a friction point, for the lack of a better way of phrasing it, where the gears just stopped and it was like that fingernails on chalkboard moment.
There's a organization I with did a great job of, reentry, reverse culture shock, and it is a thing, and it's easy to come back and I had all the emotions and then some of the story you shared. It's easy to come back with a sense of like frustration or judgment, and I did have, there's moments of that. But I think what was especially helpful was to come back and see like it's a lot of these things are relative, and again, kind of for in that world, at least kind of the spiritual need is consistent. But I think to your question, we had one of our spectacular neighborhoods we're super proud of, awesome, beautiful place. Well, I'm back, working, and we had a call that there was some mud in the street. So I go out there with a flathead shovel, and my brother's with me, and we, shovel out a few thimbles worth of dirt and get that out of there. And I thought to myself, I was just in a country where villages were completely wiped out from a river that went out of its banks and literally wiped out everything these people had. And they're completely displaced and they have nothing. I mean, they didn't have much to begin with. Now they have nothing. They don't even have the same property, because it's all been washed out. And it was just kind of in that same moment, like, all right, we're worried about a little bit of mud in the road, because somebody's going to get a little something on their tires and on their, $100,000+ car, which again, nobody wants, so I recognize that. But it was, to your point, kind of like, oh my goodness, what a moment here, considering the two places I've been just in a matter of months. And so obviously, again, it's all these things are relative and want to be mindful of people's concerns. But it certainly, pales in comparison to be a little bit inconvenienced over, having really your whole world turned upside down with some of these natural disasters that we lived around.
It's like comparing a mosquito bite to a crocodile bite.
Very true.
They're both going to leave an impact. That's for sure. We're touching a lot on faith, and what I find through the interviews that I've done so far, I'll unpack that in a second. But faith seems to be that third rail topic. That it's almost taboo, and there's no reluctance with you or me in the conversation that we're having right now. Why do you think it's such a taboo topic in construction?
I think oftentimes, people don't want to offend someone else, which, is appreciated. But oftentimes we're all a little nervous maybe to put ourselves out there to be rejected. And so when it comes to talking about our faith, we don't want to make somebody feel uncomfortable. But I think, again, this is just experience, both on my own and having, have a chance to learn, been in great churches and around a wonderful family, extended family. You just realize if it truly is who you are and it is what you continue to share and exude on a daily basis. Again, we have our shortcomings and clearly, certainly imperfect. But when that's our daily goal is to honor the Lord and give him a chance to work in and through our lives, it feels more natural. So I think even if somebody, has a disagreement or is not with you on that, there at least is a respect of, hey, you've earned the right to share that with me, earn the right to be heard. It's kind of the phrase we oftentimes come back to. So I think maybe that's why that's part of it. Or, sometimes maybe people don't want to get in that conversation because they're afraid that somebody will point something out in their life. And that's not at all what, any of us Chathams have ever felt. It's more just sharing our story and really trying to encourage people to make that decision for themselves.
Maybe part of it is the intent of the conversation. I'm not trying to convert you. I'm not trying to say I'm better than you. I'm just sharing something that really lights me up, and I want to share that light.
That's well said. I had a recent conversation with a good builder friend, and he was complimentary, I think, of spending some time around our family, in large part because he said, I feel like real comfortable talking about my faith with you guys, and it just is encouraging because, any profession has its challenges. Sometimes in the home builder world, you're beholden to that client or, the whims of, success or frustration. And so you can kind of live under the criticism or, minor little glitches you have to work through. But I think having the perspective of, hey, we need to have an eternal perspective. We need to know that we're going to honor the Lord each day, do our absolute best. And, there may be some challenges out there. We can't fix everything and not everything's going to be perfect. But when you have the right perspective, you don't live and die with every client's comment or every challenging municipality or every deal that didn't go exactly like you want to. So I think that provides perspective, and I think people see it and feel it and see the stability in that. Again, we've all ridden the highs and lows of a good deal or a bad deal, or, the last recession was, incredibly difficult to work through. But ultimately, even my dad was sharing at a real estate forum yesterday his own faith story, and it involved trusting the Lord through that incredibly difficult process, finding a way to work through each of these difficult situations. And now he looks back and think, what a great point in his testimony to be able to share how God worked through that and brought him here. And he's got a whole different level of appreciation and a whole different audience too, because everybody worked through it. So now getting to hear that story, I think is more impactful than ever before.
I wonder if part of it, when I look back to you growing up as a kid, and I was kind of teasing you that you're already predestined to be a builder because that's what you're surrounded by. You're also surrounded by faith because you're growing up in that kind of household. If I were to do a parallel to that I grew up in a household that didn't have that. And now I'm trying to understand. It's almost like I'm trying to relate. We're speaking two different languages in essence, and I'm trying to understand what you're saying without judgment and vice versa. Do you think that could be part of it? It's the absence in one side of the people that you meet versus the abundance on the other side. And when I say abundance, I'm referring to the religious upbringing that you had.
I think so. It could, potentially be like, well, those folks had it different. They had a great, upbringing, whether it was, again, we were, economically blessed. And I'm certainly thankful for that, but also a rich spiritual heritage. And so I do think maybe sometimes people feel like, well, that's what you had. It's not what I had. Or, it's easy for you to say those things if you're sitting in a good situation. And again, these are all, I think, understandable concerns or thoughts. But, again, pulling people into our lives, helping them recognize we're imperfect parents, we're imperfect home builders, employees, whatever setting we're in. But our lives have been transformed, have been radically changed. Eternally, our perspective is different. So we're not perfect, and we're simply on a path to help other folks understand what it means to have the same story of redemption that we have, no matter where you came from. And that's fun too. I think talking to, whether it's, builders or associates that we're talking to or folks in our churches, is if you had a great generation or two behind you, man, you get a chance to continue to bring that story on. If it was awful, if it was terrible, you get a chance, through God's grace, to rewrite your family's story. And, thankfully we've got a great name, that again, we didn't earn, my brothers and I, but we're carrying on. Some folks maybe have a terrible name in a community, but hey, this is a chance to rewrite that, to rebrand who you are, again, only through God's grace. So yeah, I think you raise a great issue.
Yeah. I've always liked that expression that we're works in progress.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the other one is we come from a land of misfit toys.
Very true.
Yeah. We're just trying to work our way through it. Yeah. Has there ever been a moment, either a customer that you've worked with, a build, trades that you've been, that have really tested what you believe and who you are?
I wish there was just one. Yeah, there's been a few along the way. And, again, we have the benefit of having the history of our company through dad and granddad, and there's stories they tell, about some challenging situations or people. Yeah, there's been some of those moments, and it does give you a kind of a soul searching moment. And should we even be in this business? Are we doing the right thing? And when, certainly the recessions, because there's downturns that happen periodically anyway. And so you kind of regroup, and is this even what we want to be doing? Is this worth it? But I think ultimately, again, having this bigger perspective than just the one client, just the one neighborhood, just the one situation that we're dealing with, saying, hey, this is bigger than that. There's great opportunity here. The Lord's been good to us in this business, in this industry. We feel like, again, credit dad and granddad, we've got somewhat of a positive reputation in our community. So it's worth it. We'll get through these tough ones. And I think perspective of history now with, going back to 1948, you realize these bad times come, these difficult clients come and go, but there's just enough good stories out there to continue to stack upon, and great stories where the Lord, brought us through some tough times or helped us through a situation with a tough client that, goodness, we don't want to revisit, but, we want to think that we're better off for it, having walked through some of those difficult situations. So yeah, those stories are absolutely out there. And in fact, we somewhat jokingly, as a family, sometimes we'll joke back about some of those difficult clients or situations. There may be a punchline of a joke, but ultimately we're like, hey, let's create some more opportunities, and let's continue to even have more discernment on who we really want to work with, and who we want to be a part of our projects. And so that helps too. We all learn how, hopefully have more discernment as we go forward.
Putting people aside, I'd like to go deeper into the experiences if I could. And you've lived through this, obviously, through '08, the recession, and we've had all those ups and downs, but you've been able to survive it. Was there ever a moment that you felt that you were staring into the abyss and you thought, God, what have I done? Why am I even here? And if you've been a builder around long enough, I'm sure that's come up at least once or twice. But has there ever been that moment where you thought, I have no direction? Where am I going?
So even as a kid in the kind of late 80s, really early 90s, the recession, especially in our Atlanta market that hit, we had some, even though I was a little guy and my brothers were as well, we had some, I think my parents did a great job saying, hey, we're not scaring you, nothing terrible is going to happen. We're all fine. But, these are some really tough times and things may change, our lifestyle, the house we're in, that we may have to do something, or maybe some of the little extra fun stuff we're doing, we may have to cut back on that. Things may have to change. And so I think as a kid, that kind of gave us the perspective of, certainly we love being in and around this business, but we know there's some tough times. And so through each recession, I think we've learned things. And again, we're leaning thankfully on the knowledge and experience of my dad, especially, who's walked through more of these than we have. But yeah, that '08 recession, I mean, you're looking through everything. It's like, we may have nothing left, no assets at the end of this. And one of the challenging things is we had so many failed banks in our market, and those loans then got purchased by other banks. So now we're dealing with people that have no relationship. They're not in our market. We're literally just a number on a balance sheet, for them. And so, typically you can kind of work through challenging situations with people that in the community, but we were out of our hands. This was now, we're dealing with somebody else. And so, yeah, there were moments where, and my mom jokingly would tell my dad sometimes, like, please don't let the boys go into this business. You know what I mean? It's too hard. There's too many ups and downs, so that's kind of been a running joke in our family as well. But yeah, there are those moments. And even sometimes you're dealing with 2 or 3 bad customers in a row. You're like, oh my goodness, this just isn't worth it. Is there something else we can do? And certainly, there's some other angles and opportunities. And we've gotten into some other complementary businesses, but we keep coming back to this. And I think literally every day we think of, my granddad Howard and just his desire to, he took a lot of chances, but really, and some hit, some missed, but a lot of these paid off and gave us a chance to be where we're at. And so we understand the business, we hope, and think there's great opportunity ahead. But yeah, there have been some days, and they'll come again. But I think having, again, the consistency of eternal perspective, having great relationships and, with our trades and our fellow builders in the market, I think that helps give us confidence that we can continue to work through the difficult times.
Well, you've got a strong foundation, and it's kind of a great metaphor that you spend your lifetime building strong foundations for others. And yet with so many builders, their foundation is cracking, because it's on shifting soil, if you will. The reason I asked that question about the staring into the abyss, I've done probably about 50 interviews so far with builders. And it's not that I go hunting or I'm standing out front of a mission or a church and there's a predominance of Christian builders. It's people raise their hand and they say, hey, I'd like to be on the show. Or, in your case, there's something that I saw about a post that you did or something that intrigued me to reach out. What I've found from the majority of the builders that I've interviewed, they've all had that moment where they're staring into the dark. And they've all universally surrendered themselves, if you will. And they say, from here on in, I'm doing something for God, or that's when their faith really kicks in. And I think in the pre-call that we did way back, I shared an example of one builder. It was the first one I did, Jim Lawler out of Arizona. And he came to that point where he said, Michael, we're done. There was just no where to go, up or down, sideways. You're so far down that you can't go any deeper. So you're going sideways or up. And he said, I surrendered everything to God. And I said, okay, Jim, that's great. Wonderful story. But there's more to it than that. Did you actually expect that Jesus was going to come down with a wooden hammer and wearing sandals? And you're giggling because we went through this and he's going to start framing for you. And he said, no. So let me explain it further, Michael. And he went into how they changed the core values of the company, what their goals were going to be, who they were aligning themselves with. And he said, at that point, everything, he said, it was like the clouds just started to dissipate. And from that, he said, it took a while, but from that, we built this rock solid company. And I find that it's a similar theme through all the builders that I've interviewed. Even yesterday, Joe Halsell, H-A-L, Halsell is a builder that I interviewed, and exact same thing. Alcoholic parent, but he already was born with a mallet in his hand. He knew construction was going to be the trade. But he was able to get through that diversity, 8 kids, single bathroom in the house, but now he's running a flourishing company. So I guess my question, in making a short story long here, Gabe, do you think that you have to go through the fire to really galvanize that character? And if you were to miss that step, would that be a fundamental piece of who you are that would be missing?
Great question. I definitely think so. I think it's interesting as you see, in any of these businesses we're a part of, whether it's a younger builder who's known nothing but the good times. We see real estate agents that came after the recession and just, hit a hot streak. And it's kind of like they're the greatest agent in the world, or the greatest builder developer. And, and they can, I won't say take shortcuts, but they can do things kind of how they want to do, and things will get built, things will sell. And then you see things slow down, and you see the ones that really understand the businesses well, they're the ones that will last. And so I think we do benefit from many of those downturns. And I think in the case of having the privilege of my brothers and I working with my dad every day, is sometimes, we're maybe thinking, hey, let's take a risk over here. Hey, things are good in this market. Let's keep going. And Dad, again, having lived through some challenging times more so than us, kind of helps us get perspective or rein it back in. Like, hey, let's be careful on this extra deal, because, the times when things were going so well and money was easy to come by and builders were demanding lots because it was just things were so good. And then obviously it's external forces, nothing necessarily local, that causes things to slow down. So I think that's been a good perspective. So I think my brothers and I get the benefit of not just our own lived experience, but also to say, hey, you remember that, story from early 70s when things may have slowed down, or certainly what we saw, in the early 90s, because we actually, were at least around or alive for some of those moments. So I think that perspective helps us, not just knowing from what we've experienced, but what, he's done as well. And the value too of working through our Home Builders Association is you hear some of those stories of when the market was great. I stepped into the Greater Atlanta presidency of the Home Builders Association in 2020. We had great installation event. We were at the International Builders Show. Everybody's fired up. 2020 is going to be an awesome year. We get back and it's kind of like this illness thing. We've been hearing about it. It may be real. And so all of a sudden on the HBA side, we're talking about, do we need to lay people off? What are the tough decisions we need to make? How can we help as an industry? We had some good, our current governor and governor at the time was great because he's a former home builder helping us keep our industry alive, but that wasn't the case everywhere. So you realize some of these things, everything could be looking perfect, and then there's a external issue economically, or in that case, health-wise, that changes everything. So having a healthy perspective, knowing things could change at any moment, and the old phrase, it's never as good as it feels and never as bad as it feels. Those are good things to kind of come back to. So kind of keeping that perspective. And again, we just have the benefit of having done this for a couple generations and having that perspective as well.
It just, there was a mental flash here, a movie that I saw. I think it was the Magnolia Hotel, and it's an Indian guy takes over this family hotel. And I'm trying to think, the line was, if it's not, everything's good in the end. And if it's not good yet, that means it's not the end.
That's good. It's good.
Yeah. Let's do a lane change here. We talked about some of the development that you do. Let's talk about the funding side. So when you actually jump into a project, what do you look at when you're going to fund it? Is it conventional funding, bank, hard money? Is it your own money? And is there a formula that you follow in terms of the amount of equity that you want exposed versus borrowed?
So every deal, and I know you know this from having been in the business and talking to everybody in the world, but every deal is a little bit different. And so, for us, typically there's a couple of different scenarios. It's certainly some equity from our side. We've got some really good partners who help kind of manage private money, who understand development, who understand the area, and are good patient partners. And then, oftentimes we are, taking on some bank debt as well in that capital stack. So, for us, sometimes if we don't see the investment side or the, what we see from the bank on the lending side, if that's, sometimes that's enough. We just need to put a little bit of our own in. But certainly, anybody you're doing a deal with loves to see you have your own money in there, some skin in the game. Again, reputation, certainly that's been created over the years helps. But having your own money in there, is always a good thing in terms of communicating that to our, whether it's bank debt or some private money, again, that we source through some trusted partners. So, but yeah, oftentimes trying to make sure that we don't get too extended. We oftentimes see, historically, in kind of the heyday, we did some really huge developments, hundreds of lots, but really most lenders or investors would rather see deals a little bit smaller. So that's kind of where we've trended to go, or at least phasing things. We're not trying to develop 300 lots at a time, being able to try to have a true schedule to where we think, the pace of development and lot sales would go. And so what we've learned too from, Dad and in our days with Granddad too, is you always love to have that exit strategy in place before you start it. Who are the builders that would be interested? Thankfully, we've got good knowledge of the market, but we also want to do, some true third-party marketing research to make sure we know, okay, this market can handle this price of lot, this volume of absorption, and just knowing kind of, again, what the end product should be. That really helps us. So yeah, so we're always, every deal is a little bit different in terms of the capital stack, but those are typically our three sources.
Any particular project that could tie up millions for years, are there any disciplines that you rely on to help mitigate the risk?
So, phasing that I mentioned is typically a big part of that. Oftentimes, do we already have a builder that would take those lots? We have a contract in place, or sometimes they'll put money up, to go ahead and be a placeholder. And that obviously helps, encourage anybody who wants to loan on projects. So those things are big. And again, we've done stuff outside of our area, and those are, successful as well, but trying to stay in footprints of town that we know really well is a big part of that. And so, sometimes we can, there's a project now we're working on that, we're essentially owner financing, we're partnering with the landowner. And so that one works out great too, because it's a little less capital at first. And so those are, try to get creative in some of those processes, but, making sure too that we're, having a land disturbance permit in place before we close, some things that, any lender or, anybody who's going to loan you money would want anyway, but just trying to be real smart about those kind of things. And, again, knowing absorption rate and knowing, what are some worst case scenarios? How could we make sure we can work through this community or these lots if something did go south? Is, we try to have the kind of eyes wide open going in, knowing that it may not be as perfect as we hope. So being real conservative as we build out these budgets is important.
Yeah, conservative, it seems you're risk adverse because you want to work in your own backyard, so to speak, the areas that you know. There's one builder that I interviewed. He started off in D.C. and started off with, it was either a fire hall or a gas station. I'm going to have to go back and listen to the interview that I did. But he bought this building and he started retrofitting it to convert it into a boutique condo. So it was going to be, I think it was 2-story. And halfway through the development, a bunch of guys showed up with a briefcase full of money and bought it. And he thought, wow, I'm a builder now. And he went from pouring concrete and he made the transition to, I can be doing this now, building my own thing. So then he bought another building, and this was going to be a 6-story. And again, the idea was a boutique hotel, boutique condo. Another group of investors came, bigger bags of money, threw it at him, and he said yes. So he's got that under his wings, and he thinks, okay, now I am officially a builder. I'm leaving DC and I'm going to California. That's where I'm going to find my fortune. And he goes there. And after the first year, basically his wings were clipped, and he learned the definition of humility really quickly. Because with the permits that were involved, like he was telling me, even getting a water permit on the first project that he was working on cost $125,000 for a water permit and took over a year to get. So you were stepping into, or in this case, he stepped into unknown territory. He had no idea what dragons were waiting behind the bushes. Have you ever been in a situation like that where you think maybe you bit off a bit more than you can chew?
It certainly happened. And again, I think even, really before my full-time, work in our company, it certainly happened with some bigger developments. And again, all the metrics looked like it was going to be great. And then there was a slowdown. And then it's kind of like, all right, what do we do? How do we need to pivot here? Do we need to sell some of this land or these lots? And so, that's the benefit, I think, of having, again, the generational kind of experience and wisdom that we do. And so, that certainly informs, the stuff that we work on now. And even if we're, in a situation with a local municipality, whether it's rezoning or, getting a land disturbance permit or even building permits, even if these people don't know us or know us well, just having been in these areas long enough, we're able to kind of work through those situations. And typically there's somebody who can be, I won't say necessarily an advocate for us within those offices, but somebody who at least we have some sense of relationship. Hey, help us talk through this. And for us, we want to be in these communities as long as we possibly can, for the long haul. So, we're careful to never burn a bridge or, send an email or leave a voicemail that we wouldn't want to come back to us. So trying to walk through these things in the appropriate way and being patient, even though obviously we've got deadlines and timelines and investors or even our own money that we want to make sure that we return and then some back, that helps kind of inform the way that we work. And so, again, we've learned kind of from previous experience and dad and granddad knowing, here's how you handle some of these tough situations. Here's how you handle a tough customer. Here's how you work with a municipality that doesn't seem to want to help you. All those things are really informative, I think, for us. And again, you got to be firm and stern at times, but you can do it in such a way that you can look back years down the road and think that was handled properly, and I never burned a bridge.
That's great. I should apologize in advance for not giving the due to the stature that you've deserved, Mr. President.
That's
off
right.
the bat. Let's talk about that experience for a while, because I'm part of the association as well, which is kind of funny. Ontario, Canada, a member of Texas State at the San Antonio level. Yeah, so connect those dots. But yes. I'm fascinated by what the National Home Builders Association does, the National Association of Home Builders. And you as president, are there any big lofty goals that you have in store for you next year in terms of where you want to go, how you're going to leave your mark?
Yeah, it's been a great experience, here in Georgia as our state president. And, one, you're honored that there was enough folks that are in our business to think that, it's a role that they'd want you to have for the term that you're given. And so, a big part of it is just helping our builders and associates. And so in some cases that means helping embolden, empower, lift up our local associations. And we've got, in Georgia, we've got 22 local associations. So even the next couple of days, I'll be traveling to a couple of our associations to go speak to those associations. Part of what I always try to do is help encourage the local executive officers, because oftentimes they're a small staff, even a one-man band in a lot of cases, and they need encouragement and help, and you want to come alongside them and encourage those members to really jump in and help if they don't quite have that perspective, because certainly we don't all understand all the facets of it. So a big part of what we do is at the state legislature. So we've got some really good legislation that looks like it could cross the finish line here in the coming weeks in the state of Georgia. Things that I was even talking to a couple of our on-site contractors this morning, sharing progress. They didn't know anything about it, but one of the bills we've been working on and the direction it's going, and they were incredibly encouraged because they were talking about some of these issues that they deal with, trying to get land disturbance permits and get communities started. And so some of that legislation we've been working on, I think, is, whether they realize it or not, these home builders and the associates are working on their behalf. And so it's certainly an honor, and it's having served at the local level, Greater Atlanta, a few years back, and Dad was president of that local association back in '85. So that's kind of a neat way to kind of continue that legacy. And we got brothers, as I mentioned, 2 brothers and cousins and aunts and uncles that work with us as well. And so they do a phenomenal job keeping everything going day to day, so that I have a little bit of that privilege to get to go spend some time working on it, whether it's legislation or meeting with our local associations and spending time with the National Association as well. So they've created that opportunity for me. I'm certainly grateful for that chance. So it's really neat. You get to see what's going on around the state and see what great projects and opportunities that builders have. And so, once you're in this business, you kind of get it and understand it. And so there's a kindred spirit when you go to these associations. You understand the issues they're facing. So I think it's much appreciated, I think, when you get to spend time, in these other locations.
The other cool thing, it almost becomes a mastermind that you get to rub shoulders with builders that are, above you in a good way, that they're so far down the path in terms of what they've done. And then the other side of the story, people that are looking at you like, oh my gosh, you're G.I. Joe. How do I get to where you are? And that ability to mastermind and share, you can't put a value on that. That's huge.
Well, most of these people know I'm not that great. They've been around me long enough, so they've seen plenty of holes in my game. But I think what they do appreciate is, we've got a group of folks that are in leadership positions that are advocating for them. They're fighting for them, whether you're, the monster national builder that's, building thousands of homes in the state, or you're the small custom guy or girl that's just trying to do a few projects at a time. We're going to bat for those and everybody in between, for our associates that provide great services and products for all of our builders. And so I think that's the main thing. It's a chance, people talk about giving back, and that's certainly great, but it really is a neat way to feel like you're truly serving the industry, helping these builders and developers and associates across the state. And then ultimately, we're advocating on the federal level as well with some important legislation. So just in our local Greater Atlanta Association, we have 65 local municipalities. So that's 65 different staffs and sets of rules, if you will. So, trying to help locally, state, and nationally. But again, we have great staff, at every level. So I'm thankful to get to serve alongside all those great people.
Gabe, I'm going to give you a moment here to make the president, Jim Tobin, proud. Give me 3 reasons why a builder should be a part of the association.
Well, I think first off, Jim's done a great job. He's come down to see us a few times in Georgia, and we're appreciative of that. So, I think far and away, I think any builder will tell you advocacy is crucial. If it's a tariff issue, if we're talking about restrictive government policies, and then they help us a ton on the local level. So whether it's helping us fund initiatives or, bringing in expertise, they do a great job of helping us from, DC all the way down to our little local towns and communities. I think the value they create too through events, whether it's the Builders Show, whether it's our legislative days in DC, we've got, a couple of meetings, fall meeting included, they provide great value there in content and experience, education. So a lot of folks, builders, if for no other reason, they're joining because they want the educational piece that, our local and national association provides. And so, I think advocacy, education, and then networking. That's a big deal from, our national association all the way down to the local. Our trades come from, typically, we find them as members of the association, are the fellow builders that we've come in contact with that we love working with and selling lots to. Either they came from the association or we get them in the association. I just got an email today. I've got to call a few folks to renew. And so if everybody jumps in and helps with that process, we really see some good things happen. So again, it's an honor to serve in this role, and it's neat to think that we can kind of be a conduit back to what we're seeing nationally. And because we have so many members, we create so many jobs. There's the economic numbers are off the charts. So when we sit down with a U.S. senator or congressman, our local officials, we bring a sense of value because of what we're able to do in our communities. Again, we're all individually small pieces of that, but collectively, as a national association, we do a great job. And I'm certainly thankful for Mr. Tobin's effort and hustle in trying to make our association great.
Wow. I see the runway ahead, young man. A few questions still before we go. Third generation, you're now looking into the future, fourth and fifth generation. What do you see the future of construction? How do you see it unfolding over the next 5, 10 years? Do you think AI is going to have an impact? Housing prices, interest rates, all that wonderful stuff. What do you predict is going to be the future of this industry?
On the AI topic, it was interesting. We had at our Southern Living Custom board meetings just this last week, we had a lot of good discussion on AI from some experts. And what you realize is, at least in the industries we're in, AI will have an impact, but really it's more tool related. I mean, in terms of, the real estate side, you still need a warm connection with folks. You need to be able to talk through some situations. AI can't, negotiate a deal necessarily. And, home building, until we can create a robot that can, solder copper in a house and run plumbing, there's always going to be a place for trades, and there's always going to be a physical nature to creating homes, developing neighborhoods. So again, I think the AI side, I think it will enhance, maybe speed up some processes, but ultimately I feel like we're in an industry that may be aided by AI, but won't be replaced, by any means, or maybe some small components, but really I don't see that as being an issue. Interest rates, obviously something we talk about all the time. And then, I have plenty of friends in the mortgage industry, and you call them and say, hey, what's today's rate? And it's always, what do you want it to be? So you can drive that ship. So I do think if we see it tick down here in the next, this year and beyond, I do think it'll certainly help sales. Long term, it's hard to say, but we're hoping, it stabilizes. And I think, we see so many folks that are in a 3.5 rate or maybe down to somewhere in the 2s. They have a little bit of that golden handcuff syndrome where I'd love to move, but I can't. This rate will never be matched, which is true. But you also don't want to miss out on some opportunities down the road, whether it's, a good situation for your family or yourself. And so we recognize that part as well. But yeah, I think, in our family business, it's always going to be blocking and tackling. It's the basics. It's, finding good opportunities. It's managing our relationships well. It's continuing to honor the name and the brand and the legacy that, we're stewards of. And so, there's no way to know exactly what will happen down the road, but we certainly think there's some foundational pieces of doing business the right way, taking the high road that, we hope, will continue to be the right currency going forward, no matter what changes, in our world or in our market. So we're certainly optimistic, and, we love our particular market because there's such great job creation, and, we're seeing a lot of good economic development that's going on in our state. And I think we were 13th year in a row, the best state to do business. And so, kind of that live, work, play, and pray I've heard before. We hope that's the case for Georgia and certainly the communities that we get to live in.
You got to slip that prayer part in at the end there, Gabe.
Yeah, somebody shared that. I thought
You've earned your points on that one. I'm going to do something right now. I call it rapid fire. I don't want you to overthink this. Put on your seatbelt. I'm just going to ask you a series of questions and just answer with the first thing that pops into your head. Ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Biggest misconception people have about home builders is?
They make a ton of money every time.
The one discipline every builder should master early in their career is?
I think planning and vision.
A trend in housing or development you're watching closely right now is?
We have North Point redevelopment in our market and the Gathering development for Scythe County. The reason I mention that is it may bring an arena and a NHL franchise. So those are ones that would be big drivers for our area.
Way cool. NHL franchise. Well, I know something about hockey up here.
I was going to say, you could teach me.
I'll bring my stick next time I meet you. The difference between a good builder and a great builder usually comes down to?
Long-term perspective and being proud of a project forever.
One way builders can serve their communities beyond building homes is?
I think invest in, coaching your kids in sports, attending that local church, finding that charity that's meaningful to you and your family and gives you a place to serve.
Okay. Lane change is more personal. When I finally get a rare hour to myself, the thing I enjoy most doing is
I know this isn't myself, but I think truly spending time with family, undistracted. Even when I'm with them, sometimes in our businesses, you can kind of get distracted. But I think quality time, playing, eating as a family, those kind of things are most valuable.
the one place that always helps me reset, reflect, or think clearly is.
I certainly think, corporate worship, times in church is a key part of that. And there's probably some moments after hours, if you get a little few minutes by yourself to kind of like, reposition and really see, all right, Lord, where am I at? What do I need to be focusing on? Where can I improve?
Okay. A book, a movie, or a quote that stayed with me longer than expected is.
I think that Magnolia movie, Magnolia Hotel that you told me about, that was a good quote. I think there's been some really good books on leadership that I've read lately and perspective. I keep coming back to Good to Great, honestly. Getting the right people on the bus, who you're associating yourself with. The task is important, but sometimes the people are more important. So I think that comes back often.
Good one. The one thing people would be surprised about me if they knew me.
Probably not many surprises. Trying to think. I'm probably not as handy as people think as a home builder. People think, oh, you just go, you can go build your own house. But we have such good trades. Sometimes we probably over rely on them.
Okay, last one. What a thoughtful gift. As I unwrapped the package, to my delight, I found
I think something handcrafted, somebody made, put the time in, didn't just buy something off of a website and sent to you, but something handcrafted specific to me or my family. Yeah, some type of maybe a wood product or handcrafted good that was significant, specifically to my family as opposed to something we could have gotten off Amazon.
Wow, good one. So let's wrap this up with this. Your grandfather, World War II, legacy. When you look at your children now, Ryan, Skylar, Lisa, and Hope, what is it that you hope they remember you by? What's the legacy that you left behind that's going to make them proud?
Wow, it's a tough one. I think that, honoring our family, my wife, and our four kids, certainly our extended family, which is, couldn't be greater on both sides, my wife's side of the family, my side of the family. But I think that ultimately we honored the Lord through everything, whether it was our business, whether it was coaching these kids on the sports field, serving our local church, whatever civic places we've had to serve, or even these HBA roles. But I think consistent and, honored the Lord finished well, start to finish.
I was going to wrap it up there, but you've prompted one more question, which I haven't asked. I haven't asked this in a long time, Gabe. I want you to pretend, and this I pray doesn't happen for a long, 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 long emphasis on long, long, long
Sure.
time. But one morning you wake up and you're dead, and you're thinking, well, this isn't a good start to the day. But you're standing at Heaven's Gate. There's St. Peter, and he's holding an iPad and he's flicking through. And he's giggling a little bit. He looks up at you and he frowns a little bit. And he sees you in line and he says, come up here, young man. And so now you're standing beside St. Peter. And you notice that he's going through some story of your life. He's got these little vignettes that he's playing on his high definition iPad. And as he's scrolling through, he stops and then he looks you right in the eye. He says, Gabe, not today. There's something you haven't done yet. What's that thing that you haven't done yet?
So for a while, our family, in fact, my oldest is named Raya, which is a Indonesian word for celebration or worship. For a long time, we've said, we potentially would go overseas and use real estate development as a missions platform. That's always been kind of a thought or a goal. And I feel like we're absolutely honoring the Lord and we're in his will with what we're doing now, loving our family well, being in our community. But, so some people say, well, if you didn't have this career, what would you do? And being a missionary and doing that as a family would be great. I was single at the time when I did it. So if I had some inkling that there was something else, a different path we needed to take or additional step, I would say, probably, taking our family to an unreached part of the world and using what we at least know or think we know in the real estate development world and using that as a missions platform. So don't tell my rest of my family that, but that's kind of what I would think, in that moment.
Very nice. Gabe, my friend, we've covered a lot. Anything that I've missed or anything that you'd like to put a finger on?
No, just I'll throw in the quick story. I think I may have shared it in previous conversations, but, it's neat to look back to, my granddad and grandmother getting married and that first house they ended up selling. I mean, he dug it out with a mule and a scoop and they had one car, put the headlights, and they were working nights and weekends because they had full-time jobs that everybody from their family said, you're crazy to ever quit working for the county. You got a pension, you got a steady paycheck. Why would you ever go back to something like a farming job, like building houses that wouldn't pay you, consistently? And so, 3 times over, he was building a house for him and grandmother. And each time somebody came along, wanted to buy it, and he thought, I could make a run at this. And so, from him, he never looked back, took some chances along the way. And, again, we're just honored that not just him and my grandmother, but aunts and uncles and cousins, and just had a lot of people who have gone about living their life and running businesses the right way. Again, imperfect. There's moments you wish you could redo or take back. And there's, stuff you wish you could put back in the genie's bottle. But I do think, it's just been neat to have that consistent extended family that's really created a great environment for us. And that's what I'm so thankful for my kids and my nieces and nephews is, prayerfully, they have that same kind of environment to grow up in.
Kind of neat that it all started with a 1-horsepower engine.
That's very true. Very true.
Gabe, it was an absolute pleasure, my friend. What else can I do for Gabe?
No, that's great. That's great. No, I appreciate you, great questions, and appreciate the opportunity here, and doing a great job. And I hope this is a, viable piece of information or podcast that works, for you and your audience and those that are invested in it. But yeah, I appreciate nothing else. It was great to talk to you. Appreciate your perspective and a chance to share some neat things, in our family's history.
Gabe, my friend, I'll leave it with this. To be continued.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks for listening to Builder Straight Talk. Make sure to like, comment, and share this episode on your favorite social media platform. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, available wherever you get your podcast streaming fix. Until next time, keep building smarter. This episode is made possible by our parent company, Sound Capital, funding built for builders.